Well, you with us this morning, you know that we studied a lesson that came from Acts chapter 8, and we were studying about Simon the sorcerer and his trying to make a bargain with God in order to acquire a spiritual blessing. And I guess I could have went on in Acts chapter 8, and we could have talked more about the Ethiopian eunuch here tonight. But I thought instead of that, it might be good to kind of go back and go through some of the stories that we find within the Bible and look at some of these Bible verses and some of these stories that deal with the idea of bargaining with God. I mentioned this morning, I think the idea of being able to bargain with God probably comes from maybe a sense of desperation. We might even say it is a strong desire that we have for a particular outcome in some event in life that we want. And so there are times I think that we get within our minds that, you know, we can go to God and we can kind of give God this deal where we say, you know, God, if I do this and this and this, you do this for me. Or maybe we kind of turn it around and say, God, if you'll do this for me, then I'll do this and this and this for you. And so we kind of have this idea that we can make a deal with God and God will come down to our level, or as we studied this morning, that we really have something of value to offer to God, something that God needs. And I think basically, if we were honest with ourselves, our attempts to bargain with God, it's really just to have our desires met, isn't it? That's really what we want. We don't want God, you know, telling us to do something. We want God to do what we ask Him to do. And when we have to, one of the things we have to understand about our relationship with God and really our conversations with God, what would you think of a person who came to you all the time and their conversation was what they wanted from you in life? I mean, you would think that's not a very good relationship, right? And there's probably times when God thinks that about us too. But when we view our conversations with God more like a conversation, a personal conversation with somebody else, rather than just asking for the things that we want or the things that we think we need in this life, or rather than trying to manipulate God to get the outcome that we want in life, then we're going to have a lot more humility. And instead of trying to get God to do what we want Him to do, we're going to seek His guidance and ask ourselves the question, what does God want me to do? And so tonight what we want to look at are some biblical examples, at least maybe on the surface, where it would seem like men were able to strike a deal or bargain with God. And there's a lot of these examples. I've just picked out 3 that we're going to look at here tonight. But I will say this, just because you can find an example of a man trying to bargain with God in the Bible doesn't mean that's a prescriptive formula that God is giving to us. In other words, not something that we should do. But I think what you'll notice in a lot of these stories is really that these people they failed to comprehend the nature of God. And that's one of those things when you start talking about the nature of God and comprehending God, that's one of those things that's hard for our human minds to wrap around. Exactly who God is, exactly what He wants from us. But let's look at 3 of these stories tonight. The first one is going to take place in Genesis chapter 28. I invite you to take out your Bibles and turn over there with me and read these stories, because I'm not going to go everywhere preaching the Word tonight. We're just going to kind of stay where we're at in these stories and read a little bit about them and then talk a little bit about the outcome itself. And the first person that we're going to talk about is a person that I often, when I think of him as kind of in that stage of being a bargainer, and that is the man Jacob. Now, I'm not going to go back and restudy all of Jacob's life and history. I think probably most, if not all of us, are familiar with it. But what we remember about Jacob is this. Along the way, early in his life, Jacob made some, at best, questionable decisions. And he also got into some family trouble. And so at a pretty young age, Jacob had to leave home. He had to go to live with his uncle Laban. And so what we're reading about here in Genesis chapter 28, Jacob is on the run. He's basically here in the middle of the wilderness, and now he's laid down, he's laid his head down on a rock. That's what he had to use for a pillow that particular night. And I want you to go down to verse 20 with me, and we're going to talk a little bit about and read about Jacob's vow that he makes. And it seems like he strikes this deal with God, and talk about how that fits into our picture today. But in verse 20, here's what Moses recorded for us. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Now, if you just read these verses and stopped right there on a surface reading, you might come to the impression that Jacob is trying to strike a deal with God here, right? Trying to make a bargain with him. But as you go along and read in the story, you'll find there's not really the picture that you get when you consider the entire context. Now, again, I will point out, probably wouldn't shock us if we were reading about Jacob at this point, if he were trying to strike a bargain with God. Because remember how he got his birthright? He struck a bargain with his brother, didn't he? Well, it wasn't much of a bargain. It was more of a bargain for Jacob than for Esau. But that was kind of his M.O. at this particular time. But he's not trying to strike an order or a bargain with God. He's really just complying to something that God has already stated a little bit earlier. And as you read through this chapter, again, if you just read these 3 verses, you might think, well, you know, Jacob's out here and he's laying his best on the line. He's saying, God, this is what I got to offer you. And if you do this for me, then this is what I'll do for you. But I want you to back up in the chapter here and go back up to verse 12 in Genesis chapter 28. You remember that Jacob, when he lays his head down here on this rock at night, he dreams a dream. And in verse 12, it says, in this dream he beheld a ladder that was set upon the earth, and its top reached to heaven, and there were angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. And in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you, notice this, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. As you read a little bit earlier in this chapter, it's pretty obvious that what Jacob ends up saying a little bit later on is really just what God said to him before earlier in this chapter. In other words, God appears to Jacob. He tells Jacob, I was with Abraham, I was with Isaac, this is what I did for them, and this is what I'll do for you. It wasn't the idea that Jacob was telling God, well, if you'll do this and this and this for me, then when I get back home, when I get back to the land from whence I came, then I'll make you my God. If you study the story, the history of Jacob's life at this point, you'll find that he actually spent 20 years with Laban. Let me ask you a question. Did Jacob have a relationship with God during those 20 years? Absolutely he did. He wasn't saying, God, if you do this for me, then when I get back, I'll make you my God. He already had a relationship with God. And because of that, here's what God says to him. These are the things that I'll do for you. I'll take care of you. I'll bring you back to this land. I'll give you something to eat. Make sure that you're fed. Make sure that you have clothing. And so during that 20-year stint while he stayed at Laban's house, God was his God. And God did take care of him during that stay. What I'm trying to say is this. Basically, what you have here is not Jacob trying to bargain with God. You just have Jacob agreeing to God's terms. And so he's not trying to strike a bargain with God. If I were to liken it to something, I would liken it to the agreement that we have with God today. In other words, God lays down some terms and agreements in the Bible. He says, if you do this, then this is what I'll do for you. And we have a choice to make. We don't get to step in and say, well, I'm going to keep this condition, but I'm going to mark this one out. And, you know, I like this one, but I don't like this one. It's a take it or leave it proposition. And so God says, if you want me to be your God, here's what you have to do. And Jacob says at the end of that chapter, he says, I want you to be my God. I'm going to agree to these terms that you've laid down for me to follow. So God laid it out for him, and Jacob just agreed to the terms, and that's a lot like what we do today. And if you really want to get technical, the only way you're ever going to make a bargain or a deal with God is by submitting to his terms, right? We don't have the option of going to God and demanding or haggling with him about the terms of a relationship with him. God just basically tells us, if you want to have a relationship with me, here's what you have to do. And we either say, I agree to those terms, or I'm not going to agree to those terms. And that determines our relationship with God. And that's the way it was with Jacob here. There's another story that you'll find in the same book. Go back about 10 chapters in Genesis chapter 18. And this is a story, again, probably if most, if not all of us are familiar with, when on the surface, I guess you could say, it appears that Abraham tries to negotiate a deal with God. And we're talking about the destruction of Sodom as it's recorded in Genesis chapter 18, or at least the terms, I guess I should say, of the destruction of Sodom. If you back up a little earlier in the chapter, you'll find that some angels come to visit Abraham for the purpose of telling him that Sarah is going to have a child. After they have that encounter, then these angels begin to leave. They're beckoned by God. God says to these angels, he says, I want you to go to the city of Sodom, and I want you to do a little bit of investigation for me. And the Bible tells us as God is speaking with his angels, he basically says this, I'm not going to hide what I'm going to do to the city of Sodom to Abraham, a very godly man, my servant. I'm going to tell him what's going to take place. And so as the angels go to investigate, Abraham draws closer to God. God tells him about what's going to happen to the city of Sodom. Now, again, you probably understand the specifics of this conversation, but it's recorded for us there in Genesis chapter 18, beginning in about verse 20. God says, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, very serious, I will go down now and see what they have done altogether, and whether the outcry against it has come to me. And if not, I will know it. So in verse 22, the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham stood still before the Lord. And Abraham came near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do that which is right? So the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. Now I could continue to read down through the story and probably put you all to sleep before we get to the end of it. But I think all of us understand the things that took place, right? Initially, Abraham says, if there's 50 righteous people in that city, if I can find 50, would you spare the city? God says, yeah, I'll spare it for 50 righteous people. Well, what if there's just 5 that are missing from that number? What if there's only 45 righteous instead of 50? Would you spare Sodom and Gomorrah for 45? God says, yeah, I'll spare it for 45. Well, what about 40 people? If there's just 10 lacking from the original number, that's still 40 people, 40 souls, 40 godly people. Would you spare it for that? Yes, God says. Abraham says, well, about 30. Yeah. What about 20? Okay. What about 10? Yeah. If you can find 10 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, he said, I won't destroy that city. Now, one preacher I heard say one time, God quit giving when Abraham quit asking. And maybe there's a good lesson in there for us. But I want you to think about this. Was Abraham actually striking a deal with God? Or was he coming to grips with what God already knew beforehand? You see, what God already knew beforehand is there weren't even 10 righteous people in that city. God knew the godly people there. He knew the righteous. He knew those who were there. And so on the surface, though, it seems like Abraham, it kept on working God until he got him down to his lowest possible number. But let me ask you this. How many people did God tell Abraham had to be in that city in the first place? You can look up and down and back and forward, left and right, and you know what? You'll never find a number that God gave Abraham. He never said, if there's this many righteous people, I'm going to spare this city. This number is not something that God came up with. It's something that Abraham came up with. And what God already knew is the number of the righteous people in that city. Abraham obviously thought there were more, right? He thought that there was a greater number of faithful servants of God within those cities. And so ask yourself this question: did God back down, or did Abraham simply come to terms with what God already knew? There weren't even 10 righteous people in that city. Again, I think when we have this idea that a human can strike a deal with God, we seriously misjudge God, and we start to think that God is more like us than he actually is. Let me just, again, say this very clearly. We can't work God, okay? We can't fool him. We can't trick him with our suggestions of 50 righteous or 40 or 30 or 20 or 10. That's not the way bargaining with God works. And so, again, did Abraham strike a deal with God? Did he talk God down off his high number down to the lowest possible number? No, he just came to grips with something that God already knew, but Abraham did not. This third story that I'd like for us to think about and study tonight, and the last one, the one everybody's been waiting for, is Judges chapter 11. If you have your Bibles, turn over there with me real quickly. We want to talk about a man who it seems like struck a bargain or a deal with God, but we might say in our language, he ended up getting the short end of the stick. And that is a man that's known by the name of Jephthah. In Judges chapter 11, of course, the whole book of Judges is about how God's people turn to him, and then they drift away from him, and then God sends the enemy to go and to conquer them, and they end up being carried away into captivity, or at least placed into servitude and taxes. And this has been kind of a long stint here, I think 18 years, that God's children have been under the hands of their enemies. And now they've turned to God wholeheartedly, and God is starting to listen to them, and he's going to send them a deliverer. You have the men of Gilead, the Gileadites as they're described here in this particular chapter. They seek out a man by the name of Jephthah. And they tell Jephthah, we need somebody to be our leader. We need a military commander. The Bible says Jephthah was a mighty military man, a very valiant, very brave soldier. And they said, if you'll lead us against the Midianites and deliver us out of their hands, then we'll make you our leader. And so Jephthah thinks that's a pretty good deal, and he decides he's going to try it out. Now, what he does, at least as you read about it on the surface in this passage, is it seems like he tries to make a deal with God, right? And so he goes to God, and we read in Judges chapter 11, beginning in verse 30, that Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. And here's what he said: if you will indeed deliver the people of Ammon into my hands, then it will be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the people of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. I want you to stop here for just a moment and think about this in the mind of Jephthah. I don't know what Jephthah's house or his land or his animals were like, but if I were to imagine it, this is how I would picture it. At the entrance of his place, I think there was probably a sheep or a cattle pasture. And he probably thought, as I return home, the first thing that I see, whether it's the greatest animal that I have in my flock or in my herds, I will give it to you. I will offer it as a burnt offering to you. I think what never crossed the mind of Jephthah is he would make it all the way to his house before he saw anything that belonged to him. And that it would be his one and only daughter. But that's exactly what happens as we read this story. In verse 35 of that chapter, after Jephthah is victorious, it came to pass when he saw her, that is his daughter, that he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You are among those that trouble me, for I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot go back on it. Now, I'm not going to spend the time here tonight trying to explain that Jephthah didn't offer his daughter as a burnt offering and sacrifice, but he did give her to the Lord. And he gave her to the Lord in a very special way, and that was there were a group of women that often assisted in the temple. They were known as the women of the temple. You'll read about them throughout the pages of the Bible. But they were people who helped the priest, basically did whatever they needed to do. And they didn't marry. They didn't have a life outside of the temple itself. And so Jephthah gave his daughter to that particular group of women. Means he would never have any grandchildren, his one and his only daughter here. But I do want to point this out. Was this a deal that Jephthah struck with God, or just a promise that he made to God? In other words, did he have this conversation with God where he says, you know what, God, if you give me this victory over the Ammonites, then the first thing that comes out of my house when I come back from this war, I'll give to you. Did God say, well, what you got to offer? You know, how many sheep do you have? How many cattle do you have? What condition are they in? That might be interesting to me. You don't see any conversation like that, do you? Because God didn't need his sheep. God didn't need his cattle. He didn't need anything that Jephthah could have offered to him. But he did answer his request, didn't he? And because God did what Jephthah wanted him to do, Jephthah made a promise to God. He said, I'm going to give you the first thing that comes out of my house. Just so happened that it was his one and only daughter. Now, if we learn anything about bargaining with God, this is the place to learn it here, I think, in this story. Because do you think Jephthah would have made that vow if he knew his one and only daughter would have came out of that house? I doubt it. But you know when we try to make deals with God, what kind of circumstances we do it in? Desperate ones, right? Dire circumstances. And that's where Jephthah was. He made this impulsive promise to God, never imagining that it would be his one and his only daughter that would be taken in this vow. He did it without considering the consequences. And isn't that how we are too as humans? You know, we come to God and we make this promise to him, and we think we're going to get the good end of the deal, right? We don't think we're going to get the short end of the stick. But that's what ends up happening here with Jephthah. I think what we learn from this is, I don't know if I could have done it or not. I'd like to think, as a Christian that, if I had promised God something like that, I wouldn't have any problem doing it. But your one and only daughter, could you have fulfilled that vow? The likelihood that we can often hold up our end of the bargain that we try to make with God is really little to none. Now, to Jephthah's credit, he kept his end, didn't he? He did what he promised the Lord he would do. But that's not an easy thing to do. Well, what do we learn here tonight? Here's what we learned. Some of the same things we talked about this morning. You can't work God. You can't fool him. You can't trick him by some suggestion that we give to him. Are there biblical examples when God fulfilled the request of people who asked something of him or made a vow to him? Yeah. But ask yourself this question: is it because of what they offered him? Does God need our junk like we talked about this morning? Does he need our trash? No. God doesn't need anything from us that we can provide for him. And so it's a huge mistake to think that God played the game or gave in to their suggestions because of what people promised to do for him. That's not why God answered these prayers or did what they asked him to do. Who do we think that God is? Is he just another person like us, just another human being who's interested in some items that he can get a bargain for? Do we really think that God needs the things that we're offering to him? Or do we have to come to the conclusion and the understanding like Jacob did, the only way that you can make a deal with God is by meeting him on his terms? And it's a take it or a leave it proposition. God gives that proposition to each one of us here tonight. He wants a relationship with us. He desires it. But he says this: here's what you have to do if you want to become one of my children. Here's what you have to do if you want to enter into heaven. And there's no bargaining on our part. There's nothing that we can offer God that's going to change the terms or the conditions that He has laid down for our salvation and our eternity in heaven. If there's a person who's present